Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Konstanty Gebert, Bret Stevens, Simone Rodan-Benzaquen, Jeffrey Goldberg, and Deidre Berger.
Hello. Welcome. I'm Deidre Berger, Director of AJC's Berlin office. For thousands of years, Jews have belonged to Europe. European culture, law, and democracy are imbued with the Jewish contribution. Indeed, as we know, the core values of European life and thought are based on Judeo-Christian tradition. Following the Holocaust, like a miracle, Jews were able to reestablish life in Europe's post-World War II democracies, convinced that they were assured security and freedom. Let's fast forward to 2014. What you just saw, anti-Semitism rose in the United Kingdom by a stunning 118%. In France, by 100%. And in Germany, by 25%. And even then, the government factored out incidents related to Israel, which means it was a higher rise. We also, as we know, sadly, have seen in 2015 the deaths of 4 Jews in a kosher supermarket, of a Jewish security guard in Denmark. European leaders, as you just heard, have spoken out strongly and condemned anti-Semitism, and we applaud this, and we're grateful. It's important. However, Jews in Europe, understandably, are anxious about their future, and they're asking themselves, do I and my families have a future in Europe? Let me share with you one more incident before we go to our distinguished panel. In February, I was fortunate to attend the Eurovision in Cologne. As some of you may know, what our Super Bowl is the Eurovision in Europe, a song contest, and this was 18 Jewish youth groups from all around Germany coming together to do their own song competition. For a weekend, 1,000 young German Jews under the age of 20 danced, sang, prayed, and rocked to the strains of music they composed or new things that they wrote. And they didn't avoid the hard messages. They touched on the difficult issues of anti-Semitism. But this was their message. We are here to stay. It's not easy, but Jews are part of Germany. That's the other side of what we're talking about today. We're very fortunate today to have with us Jeffrey Goldberg, who we know is a noted columnist for The Atlantic. He also wrote for The New Yorker before coming there. Simone Rodan, my colleague, the head of AJC in Paris, who's also advisor to François Zimmeré, previously the human rights advisor to the French government. Bret Stevens, the, for us, very well-known columnist, Pulitzer Prize winning, not yet, the commentator, and Konstanty Gebert from Poland, who has written for many years about Jewish life, who's a distinguished Jewish leader in Poland. I'd like to start today with Jeffrey Goldberg, whose article has certainly rose a lot of attention for all of us to the issues. Jeffrey, you spent months traveling around Europe to get a feeling for the degree to which anti-Semitism is affecting life in daily Europe. You came to the conclusion that Europe is not a very hospitable environment for Jews in many places today. And your strong feeling was to ask whether it's really a place for Jews to live today. How can we reconcile our belief in the power of democracy if we're not giving government and civil society there a chance? Should we give them more of a chance? Should Jews leave nonetheless? And should they be leaving because of the negative identity of anti-Semitism?
So let me just take 45 minutes to answer those questions.
Do it like Hillel while standing on one foot.
I'll do it without adjectives to save time. The to your question of do we give democracy a chance? Well, we are giving these democracies a chance. Some of them have done well on this question. Some of them are trying hard. Some of them are not trying hard. But you know, I don't believe as a practical matter that Jews in Europe need to be the canaries in the democratic coal mine. I don't think they have to sacrifice their own happiness, well-being, and safety for abstract principles, especially in a continent like Europe that has shown over the past 1,000 years or so that it has not been particularly hospitable to Jews. You know, I really do just take this practical notion that this is about the choices of individual Jews and Jewish families. I don't see, and maybe Simone would disagree with this, I don't see quick fixes to the problems that are affecting, especially I mean, we're talking about Europe is sort of absurd. We're talking about 30 different countries, but let's talk about France, Belgium, Scandinavia, sort of the epicenter of this. I don't see these problems going away very quickly, and so my feeling is contradictory. On the one hand, I think we have to approach this with a kind of analytical humility, and humility as American Jews who are not experiencing what our European brethren are experiencing, which is to not say you need to leave. That they can make their own choices. They're adults, and I know what my own biases are. But I would say this: that if I were living in Toulouse or Marseille or Copenhagen or wherever, and I would look at my situation in the following way: I would say, if I send my children to a Jewish school, if I want to go to synagogue, in other words, if I want to participate in the communal life of the Jewish people, am I endangering myself, or more to the point, am I endangering my children? Then if the answer is yes, and if there are alternatives, and that's the glorious thing about the Jewish present, in a way, is that there are these alternatives: Israel, the United States, North America, and even parts of Europe that are safer than other parts, then I might make that decision to go. But I just come back to this first point, because I've heard this a lot, and obviously the Prime Minister of France has talked about this to some degree, about, you know, that this is a test of France and this is a test of liberal ideals. It is. It absolutely is. But again, I don't think Jews should sacrifice themselves for abstract European ideals that have never actually been reached by Europe.
Thank you. Bret, would you agree that Jews shouldn't be the canaries? Do they have a place to go? In the United States, we also had a shooting. 3 people were killed at the Jewish Community Center in Kansas City, something that really was shocking. There are other incidents we're not always as aware of on campuses around the United States at the moment. There's a degree of anti-Semitic fervor spreading that's caught us all a bit off guard. Does this mean that the Jews in Europe should leave nonetheless?
Well, I wrote a column to that effect, and I still share the view I held in February, or whenever I wrote that column. Jews should leave now, and anyone who's in this room and lives in the United States as a Jew is here because one of your ancestors left in time. I think something that I'm certainly mindful of, although my mother only got out after the Second World War. Look, to your point, we've seen incidences of anti-Semitism here in the United States, I think much rarer and exceptional than they have become in Europe. And I think that has to do with some very fundamental differences between Europe and the United States. And I think there are differences that explain why anti-Semitism never really took real root in this country in the way that it has in Europe, and why it's unlikely to take deeper root here than what we're seeing throughout Europe. And I guess I would point to 3 factors in particular. One is religious. There is a Christian tradition of Christian Zionism, Christian reverence for the Old Testament in this country that you feel very strongly in the evangelical Christian community, but explains why there's so many towns in Connecticut named after, with old Jewish place names. that doesn't really exist in Europe. And I think the fact that you continue to have in the United States these powerful Christian affinities that inform our attitudes and inform our politics is one bedrock difference between the US and Europe. The second is that to the extent that anti-Semitism can be explained, and it can't solely be explained, but to the extent that it can be explained as a function of envy, economic or political, the United States is not organized as an envy-based society in the way that Europe has long been organized. I mean, one of the reasons why anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism tend to flourish on the left is that to the extent that Jews are successful politically or economically, they are going to be the target of that envy-based politics. When you have in the United States very successful Jews in whatever field they happen to be in, I don't know many people who say, oh, those Jews have all the luck. You look at them and you say, well, they worked harder, they had great talents, and so on. So that's, I think, a second long-standing difference, that so long as Europe is wedded to a sort of social democratic politics, you will see a level of anti-Semitism that you don't have now, at least when Jews are perceived to be doing relatively better than other groups of people. And I think the third function, the third factor, is that politically speaking, America is still potentially the master of Middle Eastern politics, or at least feels that it doesn't have to be the slave to Middle Eastern realities. But Europe is very much the slave to Middle Eastern realities, which has infected their politics since at least the Arab oil embargo in 1973. And so, I mean, there's a reason why Europe turned so powerfully and visibly against Israel starting in the late 1960s, 1970s, and it wasn't simply a matter of a changed cultural perception vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians after 1967. It was their feeling that the Arab world had them over a barrel. And you saw this come up, by the way, once again with that the CEO of the French Telecom who made those untoward comments, which he then tried to walk back. That's not true. Once again, that's not true in the United States. So I think that this country, even though I do worry about the kind of recrudescence of anti-Semitism, I particularly worry about the recrudescence of anti-Semitism on the left within the Democratic Party among people who mistakenly describe themselves as progressives. That concerns me, but I can't imagine the United States ever becoming remotely at any time in the future what Europe has become today.
Thank you. Kasha. Talking about the left and attitudes in Europe toward Israel. In Poland, as we know, following the '67 war, there was strong anti-Zionist sentiment that, in fact, was nothing but anti-Semitism. As a result, the small community that had reestablished Jewish life in Poland was decimated. Most people left. It's only a very, very small community today. You've written, not that Jews should leave Europe, but that Poland needs more Jews. Can you tell us a little about the situation as you see it in Poland, also in Europe? You're a longtime commentator on European affairs.
Poland needs more Jews for the Jewish community to thrive and flourish. We've got the demographic problem. We're a small community. I hope that part of the migration from the former Soviet Union that is still moving into Germany will stop on the way in Poland and strengthen our community. But frankly, I've been listening, Bret and Jeffrey, to your comments. I can't help notice that everybody but me is dressed in black.
It's blue.
Okay, looks like black. Are we mourning something? You guys seem to be describing a different continent than the one I live in. Jeffrey, you're absolutely right when you say that Jews in Europe are threatened in a way they had not been threatened in the past. and that we had been, we being the states, the civil societies, and the Jewish communities themselves, oblivious to that for too long. Having said that, in 2014, Jews in Europe were murdered, raped, beaten, stalked, chased, harassed, spat on, and insulted.
It's true.
Well, yes, so were Muslims, Frenchmen, vegetarians, Catholics, women, lesbians, taxi drivers. I mean, this doesn't describe our reality. You seem to be making a leap from what is an issue to what seems to be an existential danger that I do not see.
Do you believe that taxi drivers are under the same existential threat as Jews in France?
No, I'm saying that Jews in France are not under existential threat.
They are.
Uber, yes, maybe from Uber, exactly.
Apart from Uber, yes, I'll grant you that. I'll grant you Uber.
Yet another
And
German threat,
maybe the
apparently.
problem is, as you write, you describe watching the Hypercacher attack with Finkielkraut, and you write, we knew nothing about this new attack, except that we already knew everything. If you already know everything, why bother come to Europe and find out? This is not the evil demon which is always there and is threatening us. It's a novel situation in which we are targeted, but it's not about us. Europe is undergoing a fundamental crisis connected both with the slow breakdown of the integration process and the incapacity to integrate huge Muslim immigration. We are the victims, but it's not about us. Actually, what Europe is offering us is a deal. They want us to become honorary Aryans. For the purpose of the situation, we're still better than the Muslims. That's what Marine Le Pen was telling you. This is why Jews in Antwerp vote Vlaams Belang, because the thugs from Vlaams Belang are beating Arabs up on the street, so the Arabs don't beat Jews up on the street. This is an issue, and I don't think we should either leave or accept the deal we're being offered.
Okay.
You
Kosher,
quote Sachs. Let me just finish. You quote Sachs saying that Europe has added to the global lexicon such words as auto-da-fé, pogrom, and Holocaust. You're right. This is part of the European legacy. And so is democracy, liberalism, rule of law, international justice, tolerance. We Jews are part of that. Now, a Jew has the right to live anywhere,
Okay. We'll
Europe
come back now.
included.
Okay. Thank you. I need to interrupt a moment to remind everyone, please feel free to fill out the question cards on your seats. Give it to AJC staff walking around. You can also tweet questions if you're on the webcast to @AJC Global using the GLOFO hashtag. Simone, do you agree with Kasia? Is this, in fact, not something so different in terms of the attacks on Jews? Is there a general attack on liberal democracy? And is there a change in France this year? In fact, the Aliyah numbers we've just learned have gone down.
Actually, I find myself in the very strange position that I agree with all of you and disagree with all of you.
That's a traditional Jewish position.
I know. I know. Listen, to some extent, I think we in France have had we're lucky enough or unlucky enough to have had the experience over the past 15 years to reflect sort of as the first Jewish community to be confronted with the new form of anti-Semitism. It gives us the luxury to have a little bit of distance, but obviously it puts us in a situation that is extremely grave. I think what I would like to start out with is we are not in the 30s, and I think everybody in this audience needs to understand this. Jeffrey has mentioned it in his article, but it's very, very important for everybody to understand we are not in the 30s. There are two fundamental differences. The first is today there is Israel. The Jews have the choice to be able to go to Israel if they want to. And the second difference is that we have a government that not only says that there is a problem of anti-Semitism, but condemns and combats anti-Semitism. And this, I think, is extremely important. Today, the French leader of the government, the Prime Minister Manuel Valls, has spoken out very, very clearly about the threat of anti-Semitism and has created a plan to combat anti-Semitism. This is the very new thing that the government has come up with, the €100 million plan that aims to look at the sources of anti-Semitism and combat it. So I think this is very important. I think it is very reassuring for the Jewish community in France. We have also soldiers on the ground. It's on the one side not reassuring because it means we need them. But on the other hand, it shows the commitment of the French government to protect the Jewish community.
Simone, if I can now interrupt, because the first audience question is just on that point. How long can the French government sustain military forces at Jewish institutions for protections, and what happens when people leave?
Not forever, but for the moment the government has committed in doing so. It has also committed a plan to reinforce security measures from cameras to supporting the security structures within the Jewish community. So it's obviously very reassuring. But let's be honest, it's not only about that. That's the negative aspect, and that's why I have to agree with both of my friends on the left and on the right. It's not only about that. It is unfortunately also about the fact that when someone walks from a synagogue to his home, he or she might be facing a threat that cannot be calculated. So this, unfortunately, is not something that can be controlled, and it gives definitely a sense of insecurity.
Okay. I'm going to ask questions and ask something very un-Jewish, that you please be brief in your answers.
You must be joking.
I have a lot of humor. Also Jewish. Are there any bright spots in Europe is the next question, and what do you think about Netanyahu calling on Jews to leave Europe to come to Israel? Bright spots in Europe?
Look, frankly, to hear the Jews to Israel, I don't need the Israeli prime minister for that. I've got anti-Semites at home telling me that already. And yes, I'm grateful to Israel for being there. I'm not giving up on home. Europe is home. We're stakeholders there.
Thank you. Simone, bright spots?
As I said, the definite bright spot is the support of the French government. And by the way, it's not only of the government of France, of Germany, of the UK and Europe, but it's also the widespread support from political leaders, from both parties. The French Parliament has just created, with the help of AJC, a parliamentary committee on anti-Semitism. It is the only time this has ever been done in France. It has 80 members, so there's from all parties. So there's widespread support and concern about this. So I think this is very important. Also, the media. There have been tens and tens and tens of articles on the threat that anti-Semitism not only poses to the Jewish community, but that it poses to French democracy and to French Republican values. So there is growing concern, I think, in French elite about this. So I think this is definitely a bright spot.
Just to frame this a little bit in terms of actual demographic reality, just so we don't forget what we're talking about. In 1939, there were 9.5 million Jews in Europe. Today, there are 1.4 million Jews. Pew just did a study that said that the Jewish population of Europe is going to drop by another 250,000 if current trends continue over the next couple of decades. So we're talking about a small and shrinking Jewish community across Europe. That said, of course, you know, when Simone talks about the French paratroopers, I think, you know, it's both, it is a sign, obviously, that the government cares. It also signals a broad social and cultural failure in France. If you have to have 25 French paratroopers to guard a single synagogue, it means that life is not healthy in France for Jews. Let's not fool ourselves here about what's going on. That said, I'll give you just one example in Stockholm. which is not a particularly happy place at the moment for Jews. They feel, the Jewish community leaders I interviewed feel under threat. But there are interesting Jewish cultural and religious activities going on. There's a young institute there that's training young Jews in Jewish texts, and they're bringing in Jews from other countries in Europe, including Jews from the East, who many of whom didn't know they were Jewish growing up. And so that's a delightful and wonderful thing. On the other hand, in Sweden, same country, in Malmo, the city across the bay from Copenhagen, half of the Jews have fled in the last 2 to 3 years. There are more Jews in this room now than there are in Malmo, which has an ancient, a 100-year-old synagogue and a long Jewish history, but they can't stay there. It's just too dangerous. And so I think that the picture is complicated, and I think there are, of course, bright spots, but let's not kid ourselves. Almost 90% of the Jews of the world live in one of two places, North America or Israel. Europe ceased to be a main Jewish story by 1945.
I was chatting with Simone just before we got on stage, and she was talking about how beautiful Paris is, and it occurred to me that it's very dangerous when you live in very beautiful places because you sometimes fail to notice how awful things really are. It's like California. 79% of Sweden's Jews are afraid to walk around wearing a kippah. 75% in France, 59% in Britain. When you have to have a parliamentary committee and a $100 million budget to start addressing this problem, it's frankly too late. And in a sense...
By the way, when you even have to poll that question,
yeah,
it's a signal of a problem.
There's a secondary problem, which is, there are at least two issues at stake here. One is Jews dealing with a very old-fashioned kind of anti-Semitism of being spat on and being called a dirty kike, walking through certain neighborhoods, like the neighborhood I used to live in Brussels. And that's the anti-Semitism to which I think people like Manuel Valls and other European leaders are keenly attuned because of the unmistakable echoes of the 1920s and 1930s. But at the same time, in Europe, anti-Zionism, which in my view is just a 21st century version of old-fashioned Jew hatred, essentially enjoys broad respectability. When people say, well, anti-Zionism is illegitimate if you deny Israel's right to exist, but if you otherwise take views that I think most Americans, most people in this room would find stunning, that's okay. So
Bret, let me just ask, because this is a question. On this point, how much of the European turmoil is due to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, is a question from the audience.
Well,
because you're on this point.
Leon Wieseltier once sagely observed that when you have to explain what some people do to Jews with reference to what Jews are allegedly doing to some other people, then you're not explaining anti-Semitism, you're replicating anti-Semitism. I think, but let me, that's a two-edged question, because the way you're what you seem to be suggesting is if only the Israeli-Palestinian conflict were somehow better managed, if it weren't kind of exploding on people's TV screens throughout Europe, we would see less of this problem. But the very problem that you're dealing with isn't that there's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is being viewed on TV screens. It's that there are European media commentators and thought leaders and politicians who, in viewing these images, are simply ascribing blame to a rapacious, greedy, Israeli killing machine vis-a-vis a Palestinian population that is being treated as a population of innocent lambs. And so that's where the problem really lies. There is kind of bottom-up, gutter-up anti-Semitism, but there's a trickle-down anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism that sort of infests this swamp. That's the real problem that you have. It's not the low anti-Semitism, it's the high-toned anti-Semitism.
Thank you. Several more questions.
I would like just to say two things. And I find myself in this very strange position that I will now suddenly have to defend the European values. But what I want to say is what we also need to understand is that there is not a growing, widespread anti-Semitism in European public opinion. There are pockets of anti-Semitism in European public opinion that are growing. When you look at opinion polls, for example, in the 60s and today, the attitude of French people in general about Jews is much better than in the 60s. What exists today are very specific pockets that are very dangerous, not only for Jews, but generally for French society. The first one is the extreme left. Bret spoke about the anti-Zionistic extreme left. This one is definitely very important. The extreme right, and then minorities within the Muslim community. But it is not a broad support of anti-Semitic opinion in French public opinion. We're not speaking about an anti-Semitic France or anti-Semitic opinion all over Europe. I think this is very important to know for this audience.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there's several questions. Wait, Kostek, we have a question for you. Sorry, we need to move on just a little because there's lots of questions. Jeff, do you think the spotlight being shed in the media on Jewish life in Europe is in itself tarnishing existing European Jewish communities? For Kostek, we're seeing the rise of right-wing national parties with Poland's new president. How does the Jewish community feel about this? From Twitter, if Europe's Jews leave, doesn't that admit defeat? Someone else, perhaps Bret, can answer that. Kostek, you want to start? But
okay.
Also touch on the new president. And
we've just elected a slightly nutty guy as president. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen only in Poland, okay? Even in this country, Christian Zionists, regardless, and if I understand correctly, the envy built in social democracy as opposed to the altruism built in free enterprise.
No, admiration. Admiration for success.
Even in other countries, we do get nutcases as president. Point is, I live in a city which is arguably one of Europe's ugliest capitals, Warsaw, this courtesy of our German neighbors. So I'm not exactly blinded by beauty, but I walk around Warsaw with a kippah on my head, and occasionally I hear a nasty comment, infrequently. And I've learned not to respond, because I know that if I want, a passerby will respond in my name. I can rely on the Warsaw street, the way that unfortunately I know I cannot rely on the street in Paris. I've had the experience. So there's Europe and there's Europe. And Europe changes. The point which I think is fundamental here is that in practical terms, Jeff, you're absolutely right. Demographically, we're declining and dwindling. And this is why I said I want more Jews in Poland. But it's not only about sheer numbers. What stuns me is that you're discussing the possibility of Jews just giving up on Europe and moving elsewhere, Israel, California, as if it didn't matter. This is 2,000 years of our identity. It is not a price-free choice to make. We cannot amputate ourselves from where we developed as a nation because we'll stop understanding ourselves the way that, unfortunately, some of us have already stopped understanding Europe. Having said that, a Jew is free to live anywhere, Europe included.
Thank you. The media, is this in part a media-fueled problem? Our perceptions of anti-Semitism in Europe, Jeff?
I don't really care. I mean, it's not, these questions about, you know, I'm for the media focusing itself on legitimate problems, and this is a legitimate problem, so I don't think that the media plays quite the role that the questioner might think. I want to just go to one other thing here that's interesting to me, and you brought this up. If the Jews of Europe leave, and of course they're not actually leaving, but let's put that aside. Let's talk about the theoretical.
The large numbers theoretically.
You know, is that a defeat? Who is it a defeat for? I mean, I don't think it is the responsibility of the Jewish people to save the ideals of the European Union. I just don't. I mean, I think, you know, and
Simone, do
These
you
happen
agree?
to be our ideals as well.
I think, well, it depends. It depends. First of all, I think there is the issue of individual choices. I would not condemn anyone who decides he wants to go to Israel, to the United States, or stay in Europe. It's an individual choice. But to make the policy decision that Jews should be leaving, I think it's dangerous. And I think it's dangerous for everybody, including the United States, because it means that basically they won. So from my perspective, yes, it means a defeat. And again, I think when you look at, Jeff and I spoke about this earlier on, when you look at the writings, for example, of the person who wrote, inspired ISIS, the idea is to create what happens right now, is to threaten European democracy, to turn Muslim minorities against the European societies, and to create a fracture within society. So yes, Jews are the first victims, and I understand absolutely Jeff's comment, why should Jews be paying the price for a European wider problem? But from a policy decision, I think it is absolutely essential that Europe wins the battle. So we all have a stake in it. Not only we Jews who might be deciding that we want to say and fight the battle, but also the United States and every liberal democracy in the world has a stake that Europe should win this battle.
Look, but
As a last question, if you could just touch briefly on this, do we as a Jewish community have an obligation to win this battle? Everyone, just very briefly, because we have to wrap up.
Speaking not as a journalist, but as a Jew, I think we have an obligation to make sure that Jews around the world are safe and happy. However that manifests itself is how it manifests itself. I am not romantic about the European Jewish past, and I'm not romantic about the European Jewish future. If the Jews of Toulouse are happy, healthy, and safe, then I'm incredibly pleased. I don't see them coming into a position anytime soon in which they are those things. And so I think our obligation, and this is complicated for a large organization like American Jewish Committee, which has taken the lead on these issues. On the one hand, you want to be supportive of all Jews where they are. On the other hand, you want to examine this with clear eyes, and you want to make those decisions.
Thank you. Bret. Simone, you've already answered, Bret.
I've been reading this wonderful book, which is called Not I. It's a memoir of a German childhood, a German Catholic childhood from a German literary icon who was Catholic and whose father had been urging their Jewish acquaintances in the 1930s, get out, get out. And all these German Jews had one good reason after another. I fought in the First World War, I have an Iron Cross, or that's exactly what the Nazis want us to do. They want us to get out. And the father makes the observation in this book. He says, the German Jews are such amazing people, brilliant, witty. They're the essence of Prussianism. He means that as a compliment. He says, but they have one problem. They have lost their instinct for danger. And I understand it's not the 1930s, it's not the 1920s. I don't know. It's this decade. But what I would urge European Jews to have in beautiful cities like Paris or less beautiful cities like Warsaw is to have an instinct for danger. I have no doubt that Manuel Valls and the Fifth Republic of France means well towards its Jews. I'm just not so sure how long the Fifth Republic of France is going to last. I'm not sure if Marine Le Pen or someone else will be the next prime minister or president of France. I worry when I listen to someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary talk about creating an illiberal or a state based on national illiberal foundations. That's a direct quote. So it's not what Europe is now that should worry us. It's a trend line. And the problem is, it's not simply the anti-Semitism. It is a society, a European Union that is producing economic stagnation for its people generation after generation. We know where that leads. So I guess my message is have an instinct for danger. Don't idealize the present. Don't wish for the best. Understand where things might be going and act accordingly while you can.
Costa, is that your message as well? Briefly,
Look.
very briefly.
Having spent half of my life under communism and 10 years in the underground fighting it, I'd say I've got a pretty good instinct for danger. But I also know that the future is, to a large extent, what we'll make of it. Had we done nothing under communism, we'd be still living under it. And yes, you might be right. Maybe Europe is doomed. Maybe Israel will overrun. Maybe the Tea Party will run the United States. In the meantime, there is a struggle that we are part of. And it won't be won if we won't be fighting it.
Thank you. Thanks to this wonderful panel. Very thought-provoking. The many facets today of European Jewish life. One of those facets is that there is anti-Semitism. We've seen yesterday a very touching ceremony with someone who helped save Jewish life. Someone in Copenhagen was less fortunate. Dan Uzan. We'll be hearing more shortly. Thank you.